Nameless Blade. A simple sword forged by a village smith, more suited to fending off small animals than actual combat. Smash, 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 smash. Sweat rolls down the faces of hard-scrabbled men as they chip away at ironstone, their cheerful singing echoing through the mine. We are workers, workers in the mine, dirty from tip to toe. Again today we search for iron with all of our might. Smash, 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 smash. Fun, 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 fun. The sound of women stomping on the bellows in the mill, the sound of iron being gathered from the scorched sands. We are workers, workers in the mill, workers who send wind. Today we stomp the bellows again with all our might. Fun, 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 fun. Clang, 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 clang. The sound of swordsmiths wielding hammers at their forges. The ringing of such transformative blows is stunning indeed. We are swordsmiths, swordsmiths who bring blades to life, lords of steel. Clang, 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 clang. Rip, 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 rip. The sound of flesh being rent on the battlefield. The sound of killing enemies, killing someone, killing humans. Someone help me. It hurts. It hurts so much. Help me, mummy. Rip, 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 rip. Iron pipe. A relic of the civilized age. Its rusty scent comes from the blood of all who dared oppose the wielder. May 21st. We have finally run out of money. Food just costs a lot more nowadays because of the war. We tried begging at the church, but they have their hands full caring for the wounded and can't spare anything. Yona has really lost a lot of weight. I wish I could get her something to eat. July 15th. We met a nice lady who gave us some food. At first, I thought she was homeless like us, but she said she was joining some kind of relief and support thing run by the government, so we decided to go with her. At least Yona seems to be doing okay today. August 1st. That nice lady from before used the book and turned into a monster. We ran away as fast as we could, because I couldn't think she's human anymore. Everything those adults told us was a lie. They won't give us money, and they won't treat Yona's illness. Also, there's a huge wall around the city now, and we can't get out. We never should have come here. August 5th. It's so cold today, I can't believe it's summer. I can actually see my breath. We decided to hide from the monsters in an abandoned supermarket. We found a few old cans of food there, but now those are gone. Also, Yona's cough just won't quit. I've got a really bad feeling about this. Kusanagi. A man whose fiancée was spirited away by an 8-headed beast used the sword to smite his foe. The shield left hanging on the wall was covered in dust. The blade left in its cardboard had rusted over. The techniques I had used were forgotten. The body I was to train was left to grow soft. I had lost the will to practice discipline. I thought things would end without a single word said. I pretended not to see violence inflicted by others. I had given up, assuming things would never change. I believed there was no way to oppose such a great power. I sneered at hearts that tried to believe anyway. I laughed, thinking them brainless fools. Those were the thoughts I had taken refuge in. I had given up, believing nothing was possible in the end. I lamented the foolishness and ugliness of it all. My life had lost all meaning. I had lost sight of those who were precious to me. I could not believe in their kindness. I was unable to save them from the grief that tore at their hearts. I had forgotten the courage it takes to protect the smallest of joys. I believed my words would never reach you. Transience. A knight was so moved by the suffering of a beggar that he removed all ornamentations from this spear. They were a frighteningly diligent people. They would clear forests and hunt animals even when they had no need. They developed techniques to preserve food they were unable to eat, and earned more money than could ever be spent. Yet there was not a single one amongst them who did not accept these practices, for they knew of no other customs. They were frighteningly studious people. Their grasp of calculation and science exceeded any pretense of practicality, and they would repeatedly engage in spirited debates regarding predictions of the future. They invented an increasingly difficult language, and created an infinite series of complex machines, which they would immediately discard. There was not a single one among them who looked back, for none knew of any reason for concern. They were a frighteningly obedient people. Without ever being told, they would greet the morning sun at the same time, in the same clothes, while toiling away in the same cramped rooms. Yet there was not a single one among them who complained, for none knew what else they should be doing. Having worked far too much, the people lost their forests and took to living atop the sand. Having grown far too intelligent, the people conversed in a language that no other peoples could comprehend. Having grown far too well behaved, the people were unable to defy the laws that would be established one after the other, and came to live their lives enclosed by tens of thousands of rules. Beastcurse. A noble lord commissioned this beastly weapon that the world might stand in awe of his power. Long, long ago in a faraway kingdom, there lived 3 brothers. The youngest was a terrifically lazy lad who spent most of his days fast asleep. However, he was every bit as cheerful as he was lethargic, and so was beloved by all. When the nation was beset upon by a most contagious disease, the youngest son did not but laze about the palace, humming to himself all the while. But his cheerful music comforted the townspeople, so instead of hating him, they sang his praises. "Oh, what a fine young man," they would say. "Just the finest young man you will ever find." When the nation became embroidered in war, the youngest son did not but laze about the palace, telling stories of the good old days all the while. But his fascinating stories helped the townspeople forget the horrors of war, so instead of hating him, they sang his praises. "Oh, what an amazing young man," they would say. "Just the most amazing young man you will ever find." One day, the youngest son was lazing about the palace as usual, when he realized he could no longer hear the voices of the townspeople, and he wondered why that might be. He lazed and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. He lazed and he wondered. Eventually, all that wandering tired him out, and he went to sleep. That is why, in that nation where all have perished from war and disease, the only sound that can be heard is the soft snoring of a young man. It is a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness, a nation of happiness. Beastbain. A sword that bears a beastly motif. Its short, thin blade seems eager to vanish from sight. Long, long ago, in a faraway kingdom, there lived 3 brothers. The middle brother was a famous general who commanded a vast army. People everywhere were terrified of his troops, for they were most violent indeed. This general loved to make war. He enjoyed nothing more than watching cities burn and corpses pile up, and he fought not to subjugate, but simply to destroy all that he could. His well-trained soldiers laid waste to towns, cities, and even nations for the sake of their general, and as they hewed and hacked and chopped, the general would chuckle to himself in the most vulgar of tones. The army marched on and on, nations by the sea, nations in the mountain, nations in the deserts, nations in the tundra, nations to the east, nations to the west. The general cared not, he simply wished to watch it all burn. His orders were absolute, and for years beyond counting the soldiers killed and 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 killed. After some time, the army arrived in a certain nation. They killed its soldiers, they killed its townspeople, they killed its princesses and princes and dukes and bakers and lawyers and accountants and beggars and thieves. Eventually, a shabby general came pleading for his life with tears in his eyes, but they killed him as well. However, the soldiers thought he seemed familiar and tried to recall how they might have known him. In that moment, however, the general's daughter appeared, and they became so engrossed in ending her life, they never thought about the matter again. Beastlord. A beastly sword whose keen edge stands ready to mow down all who question the divine right of the wielder. Long, long ago, in a faraway kingdom, there were 3 brothers. The eldest brother was a king who ruled over the nation entire. He was a most terrifying king, feared by all. Each day, the king would select one of his subjects to execute as a sacrifice. This day, he chopped off a mother's head and forced her family to watch. The head spun 3 times as it flew through the air before landing next to the head of her son, who the king had previously killed. Oh, the horror of it all. But the king merely watched the sight unfold before him and laughed in a most unsettling voice. One day, the king contracted an illness most dire, one which caused his body to rot while he was still alive. But though deceased, the king would still drag his decaying flesh to the executions all the same. His retainers dared not defy their king, so they continued to kill day after day after day after day. In the end, the king rotted and died. His was a most disgusting, foul, rotten death, but his retainers continued carrying out executions before the king's rotted corpse every day, killing. Every day the rotted king and the rotted retainers and the rotted citizens and the rotted you. Phoenix Spear, forged by monks from feathers of the legendary Firebird. This spear was designed as a tool of self-defense. There was once a warrior in a frontier nation who feared not death. He was so brawny and powerful, arrows were said to bounce harmlessly off his flesh. For this reason, the warrior always threw himself into the thick of any battle. One day, a beautiful bird appeared before the warrior in a dream. The bird commended the warrior for his valor in battle and offered to grant him one of two wishes. The bird could bring an end to war and grant peace to all the world, or the bird could bequeath the warrior an immortal body. The warrior chose immortality. From that day forth, the warrior's exploits were nothing short of astonishing. He mowed down foes in uncountable numbers. No amount of arrows or swords or axes could slow his march. The king showered him with titles and gifts, and for a time, it seemed the warrior's days of stunning glory would continue until the end of time. But conflict did not cease. Eventually, the warrior's frontier nation was invaded so often that the flames of war left the entire country in ruins. Crops withered, people perished, and before long, there were none left who even knew the warrior's name. The shattered warrior was tortured day and night by endless starvation, but his body refused to let him die. So he sought out the bird again and pleaded for it to grant him release. "Ah, but you cannot die," chirped the bird in response. "You will never die." Phoenix Sword, a large sword used by temple guardsmen and supposedly made from feathers of the legendary Firebird. This is the story of a time long, long ago. There was once a beautiful bird with resplendent feathers that lived a quiet life deep in the forest. One day, a lost child wandered into the woods. He came from a place of famine and had been abandoned in the forest as a way to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Taking pity on the feeble, starving child, the beautiful bird plucked one of its own feathers and gave it to him. When he returned home, his family was overjoyed by the feather and permitted him to live with them once more. Hearing the child's story, one person after another descended on the forest to tell the beautiful bird how poor and unfortunate they were. Each time, the bird would pluck a feather and give it away, pluck a feather and give it away, until it had none more to give and its once beautiful visage had become shabby beyond recognition. But the shabby bird had no regrets. One day, the original child appeared before the shabby bird, which was featherless and freezing in the cold. He had come seeking a bird with resplendent feathers, that he might repay the creature's early kindness. Overjoyed, the shabby bird said to the child, "It is I you seek. If I may beg a favor, would you hold me to your chest and warm my freezing body?" Sparing a single glance at the shabby bird, the child called it a liar and cut it down with a large blade. He then rose to the bird, ate every last part, and set out anew to find the beautiful bird who had once saved his life. Phoenix Dagger, a ceremonial blade crafted from feathers of the legendary Firebird. It is untested as a weapon. There was once a woman who promised her hand to a man who was departing for the front. Devout by nature, she spent mornings, afternoons, and evenings in prayer for the safety of her beloved. Perhaps in response to her earnest pleas, one night a bird enveloped in light appeared to her in a dream and began to speak. "The man you love will surely return safely," said the bird in a beautiful voice. Those words brought great comfort to the woman, and she began weeping tears of joy. "However," continued the bird, "his heart will surely not." Soon, the man returned as the bird had foretold, his body covered in scars beyond counting. But as the bird had also foretold, he returned with an unfamiliar woman of extraordinary beauty at his side. Despite this, the pious woman could not contain her love for the man, and ran out to meet him as he approached. Surprised, the man embraced her, then collapsed to the ground. The pious woman stood over him, a bloody dagger in one hand, and the ripe crimson fruit of his heart in the other. "His heart will stray no longer," she whispered. Amidst the gathering pool of blood, Her face awash with pure ecstasy, she placed a tender kiss on her beloved's heart and offered a prayer of gratitude. Labyrinth's whisper. Forged from steel and liquefied beast fangs, the blade is red with the blood of countless sacrificial offerings. So this girl had a huge set of horns on her, beautiful horns like a bow, just growing out of her head above her ears. I had myself a gander at where the horns meet the head, and let me tell you, they were coming straight out of her skull. She was the only kid like that in the whole village. The others were all normal. The kid with the horns though, born real small apparently. The horns were, I mean, not the kid. And hell, they wouldn't need it to be. Fat chance the kid's mama would have been able to push out a pair of horns huge as that. You'd think a girl like that would have been bullied, right? Well, you'd be wrong. That kid was the hardest person for miles in any direction. Wasn't a man in the village who'd tangle with her. And we are talking men that ain't scared of nothing. She was the best at doing work what needed physical strength and all that. And she always led the charge whenever shades attacked. All folks loved her for that, sure. But most of all, they loved her because she was always cheerful and just plain tough. But one day, this huge shade attacked the village that was just too strong. It tore the men apart like old rags, and half the guys in the village died. The girl with the horns fought with all she had, but eventually she couldn't keep up, and the shade lifted her off the ground and ripped the horns right out of her head. The way she screamed was like nothing you'd ever heard. Sound shook the earth itself, it did. After that, things got real quiet, so I stepped outside and found both the shade and the girl dead. Each of them had wounds all over, and they were leaking blood out of just about everywhere. And don't judge me for saying this just now, but it was almost beautiful. Like looking at dark red flowers in full bloom, you know? I hope that answers your first question about why folks in this village can't hear nothing. But you should know, none of us think badly of the girl for making us this way. Being deaf is a hell of a sight better than being dead. Anyway, we have all talked over that day to death, and we think that final scream was her way of saying goodbye. Everyone in the village is honored that the last thing we ever heard was her farewell, and that's the God's honest truth. Labyrinth Song. A sword forged from metal and liquefied beast horns. Its dull glow lures people deep into the labyrinth. It was a beast that lived in a cavern's deepest, most untouched depths. It had massive horns, a body like steel, breath of scorching fire. The peace-loving villagers hated this monstrous beast with the head of a bull and the body of a human. They feared it, and soon the beast became known as the Minotaur of the Labyrinth. Contrary to its terrifying appearance, the Minotaur was exceptionally kind. Not only did it refrain from harming other creatures, it took great care to not trample flowers beneath its owlish feet as it walked. Indeed, the reason it lived so deep inside a cavern was to help avoid frightening the villagers. One day, a lost girl wandered into the beast's cavern. Frightened by the sight of it, she cried so hard she eventually passed out, which left the beast in quite the quandary. I have no choice, the beast finally decided. I must take the poor thing back to the village, for her mother and father will be terribly worried. 2 days after the girl vanished, her panicked parents found her sleeping soundly in front of their home. On the ground a short distance away was the dead body of the Minotaur. It had been impaled by several swords, and the blood scattered around it held an almost otherworldly quality. Yet there was no indication the beast had attacked the girl. In fact, it looked as though it had been trying to place as much distance between itself and her as possible, so as not to dirty her with its blood, almost as if it didn't want her to be afraid. And then, having curled up to make itself as small as possible, the monster died. Labyrinth's shout. Forged from metal and liquefied beast claws, this destructive spirit is filled with a deep hatred of the world. She was a hopelessly slow woman, impossibly clumsy. It would take her 3 times longer than anyone else to accomplish a task. She walked slowly, talked slowly, she even blinked slowly. So slow was the woman that she could not even draw water to anyone's satisfaction. The children began calling her the cow and laughing when she passed by, but she would only chuckle in response. She was a hopelessly dull woman. When she fell and drew blood, she would carry on as though in a daze. Though coins often dropped from her purse, she never managed to retrieve one, and if someone spoke ill of her to her face, it would take hours for her to realize the insult. When the children saw her, they would hurl rocks with glee. She was a hopelessly foolish woman. One summer, when the village was suffering a most terrible drought, the woman vanished. The children all starved to death. The villagers spent no time worrying about the woman who ran away. 2 days later, rain fell and the village was saved. But the woman did not return, and on the 20th day, a shaman arrived at the village. The shaman held a spear with a pair of horns that was oiled and sticky to the touch. So heavy was the spear that none could wield it effectively, although even if they managed to lift it, the weapon was incapable of piercing through anything at all. The shaman forced it on the people and left it with them, but none dared approach it, and to this day it quietly slumbers in a forgotten corner of the village. Fool's Embrace. A sword created after a man, driven mad by revenge, sealed away a cursed dragon. I was saved from the despair that shackled me. I was freed from the fate that cursed me. I was pacified from the indignation that plagued me. I was changed by the day I met you. My flames will scorch earth below. My fangs will know the taste of blood. My claws will rend my enemies asunder. My wings will soar the skies above. If your eyes are to be robbed of their light, if your skin is to be stained with blood, if your sword is too heavy a burden, if your lips can no longer produce speech, even if this body is snuffed out, even if these words are stolen, until our contract is complete, until the moment this warmth is lost. Fool's Accord. A lance birth as part of a pact with an ancient red dragon. This is the story of a sorrowful prince, a tale of a kingdom in time long past. Attacked by the forces of darkness, this nation was annihilated in a single night by inhuman soldiers with red eyes and a group of black dragons so numerous they blotted out the sky. Having infiltrated the king's castle, the black dragons visited upon the king and queen a most horrible fate. It is said that their stomachs were torn open by the black dragon's mighty claws, and the very floor they stood upon became a sea of blood. The prince and princess, though racked with sorrow, escaped to live another day. The prince, spurred by the shock of witnessing his parents' tragic end, became consumed by a desire to exact vengeance. This is the story of a terrifying prince, a history of a conflict in the long ago. Obsessed with laying low his hated enemies, the prince indulges in his vengeance day after day after day. Even when faced with foes who take heel, he chases them down and tears them apart from groin to gullet. The carnage is so horrific, his fellow soldiers whisper tales of how they saw him mutilating bodies that were already long dead. Perhaps because no commander can control him, the prince is sent to an even harsher battle. This is the story of a fooled prince, the whereabouts of fate in the long ago. The prince's next battleground is a castle that guards a goddess. He lays waste to all before him, hacking arms, cleaving legs, rending stomachs, gouging eyes, separating heads from shoulders. But soon, the injured prince can no longer tell the difference between the blood that rains down and that which comes from his own wounds, and he collapses in a heap. As he writhes in pain, coughing up gouts of hot blood, he lifts his gaze and sees a hated dragon standing before him. This is the story of a mad prince, a meeting with a dragon in the long ago. An injured red dragon stands before the prince, and though it is a different color than the beast that killed his parents, he feels the need to avenge himself upon it regardless. But as he raises his sword, the dragon says, "In exchange for both our souls, human, I will save your life and grant you power." After some thought, the prince makes the pact. It matters not to him what he might lose in the deal, or that it involves a dragon. All he cares about is that he can continue swinging his blade. So he swings and swings and swings, and with each blow, his heart fills with a desire as black as the deepest night. Fool's Lament. A weapon with a heroic dragon motif, used by a man who tried to save the world. Memoir, June 6, 2003, approximately 1500 hours. A massive white humanoid, initially called the Weapon, but since renamed the Giant, falls from the sky above Tokyo's Shinjuku ward, inflicting tremendous damage. At the same time, a large red creature, henceforth referred to as the Dragon, appears and engages the Giant in combat, though both the nature of its attacks and their utility remain unclear. As the Self-Defense Force contemplates methods by which they might attack the target, the government established the Bureau of Emergency Countermeasures. Memoir, June 12, 2003, approximately 1600 hours. The Giant, which was locked in combat with the Dragon, suddenly begins to collapse for reasons unknown. The Dragon is then shot down by the 6th Division, 303rd Squadron of the Air Self-Defense Force. No official record exists of who issued the order to attack the dragon. Work has begun to retrieve the remains of both the giant and the dragon, but no official verification has ever been made regarding which organization performed the retrieval. Memoir, December 2003. The first case of white chlorination syndrome is confirmed in Tokyo's Shinjuku ward. Memoir, July 2004. Humans continue to turn violent due to white chlorination syndrome, with fighting growing increasingly intense in infected regions. With the cause of the disease still unclear, the infected are isolated, and violent riots suppressed by force. Main thoroughfares are sealed, and rail transportation is halted, later leading to all of Shinjuku being sealed off. At this time, the prospect of asking the American military for non-official intervention is considered, but the government defers. Meanwhile, research begins on mesoparticles obtained from the giant and the dragon, as well as on countermeasures for white chlorination syndrome. This research ultimately leads to the founding of Project Gestalt a decade later. Cruel Oath. A sword imbued with negative emotions by an unknown smith. Its black blade, night invisible in the dark of night, bewilders all who dare confront it. I'm starting your boot sequence. As you lay resting before me, I call out to you. I want to let you sleep a little longer, but I've got my orders. Let's start by getting the brightness set. I was the first thing you saw after you woke up. I hope my hair looks alright. Let's check your voice recognition settings. Can you hear me? Mine was the first voice you heard after you woke up. I have to try and keep my voice nice and deep. I don't want to sound too excited. Okay, settings should be good to go. Good morning. And so we peacefully boot up to face yet another day. Another day of killing our machine enemies. Virtuous Treaty. A white katana, said to have been forged by a swordsmith in a distant eastern land. Presented as an offering to the nobility, it was apparently never used in combat. My family has decided I am to be betrothed. I cannot resist, for I am but a tool. The man who became my husband possessed terribly cold eyes, but he too is a mere tool to be used so his family might prosper. He treats me well in his own way, but I was still unable to properly respond to his kindness. One night he calls me to his chambers, still thinking him a kind man. I go to him willingly. As he greets me, I stare at the beautiful white katana he holds in his hand. Virtuous Dignity. A white spear crafted by an alien blacksmith. Some claim the face upon it represents its creator's ecstasy, but others say it shows the pain his wife felt as she was stabbed to death. There once existed a cursed spear whose holder would inevitably meet a violent end. Eventually, the weapon found its way to a mechanical automaton that possessed no soul, and though it was a mere machine, the spear delivered countless deaths upon it all the same. The automaton warred against mechanical weapons much like itself. It was crushed to death, burned to death, and thrown to its death from great heights. Yet each time, the automaton was reborn and thrown into battle anew. The war became fiercer and more complicated. There were self-detonation suicide attacks, false operations, and betrayal by companions. Indeed, it seemed to the soulless automaton that it was inhabiting a kind of infinite, cyclical hell. Finally, the automaton died a final time in order to save its trusted companions, an act that precluded the possibility of ever returning to life again. But as pangs of agony spread through its body, the automaton found its final rest. Virtuous Contract. A sword imbued with negative emotions by an unknown smith. Its white blade, resplendent in the sun's light, clouds the vision of any who dare confront it. Pod. Relay the following to command. Mission complete. Destruction of target verified. I will return to the bunker after recovering the remains. Over. Pod. Relay the following to command. I have made contact with the operations target. No suspicious activity observed at present. I will continue monitoring the target. Over. Pod. Relay the following to command. I investigated the target's observational records but found no hostile behavior, requesting target re-examination and the temporary suspension of this operation. Destruction of target verified. I make no apologies, for I promised I would not. Farewell.